In this video, we compare the Sony RX100 VII versus the Canon G5XII. The photographer's 1-inch sensor camera seems to have been replaced by more vlogging cameras by Sony. That G5X Mark II was a highly rated camera that's been discontinued, but yet it's still highly sought after. So we're going to see how this Canon camera compares against the Sony. They both look very similar, have a lot of similar features, but what about the picture quality? We're going to take a deep dive. No, not that kind of dive. The kind of dive where we really examine the features, differences between these two cameras, photo, video quality. You're going to see a lot of examples. And if you stay tuned to the end of the video, I think you'll be able to decide which camera is the right one for you. And I'll also give you my opinion as to which one I'm going to keep and which one I'm going to sell. But you have to watch to the end. So let's start with checking out their bodies. Both cameras super small and light, 302 grams for the Sony, 340 grams including battery for the Canon. You can barely feel any difference in the weight, but the big difference is the finish. The Sony has a shiny casing, and it's very slippery, and it's almost like an accident waiting to happen if you don't have some sort of strap, whereas the Canon has a nice grip and more of a textured, more modern finish. And for these reasons, the Canon is a little easier to hold and use. There are plenty of aftermarket little devices if you want to get a grip for the RX100 VII, and I highly recommend it. Now, from the top down, the Canon has two dials on top, whereas the Sony just has the standard PASM dial. The Canon also has an exposure ring, which is nice, except that it's not locked and often can be turned accidentally when you change the top dial. And you may not realize that happened, and sometimes your pictures are over or underexposed. So while it's nice to have a nice small compact camera, it's also a disadvantage too because it's so small and the buttons are so tiny. The shutter button on the Canon is a little more elevated and spongier than the Sony's, which is more flush to the body. Both have very nice, clear rear LCD screens. Both are tilting screens and flip up for those vlogging and selfie moments. When looking head-on, the Canon screen is a little higher because of its slightly higher body. Neither are great in bright sunlight, very glary, but I think the Sony has a little bit of an edge. The Sony name will be upside down when your rear screen is tilted up, so all you have to do is just simply stand on your head and it'll be the right way. Now, the Canon has a lot of advantages in terms of touch controls. You can touch the menu. You can press play on the screen to play back your video. You can pinch in on your photos like you do on your cell phone. Now, you can try doing that on the RX100 VII, but there's very limited touch controls. You won't get anywhere. You have to use the rear control ring to cycle through your menus. So if you're used to using touchscreens, and we all are, this becomes very frustrating as nothing seems to work. So basically, can't touch this. But maybe you can touch that like button and help the channel grow, and subscribe as well. It's much appreciated if you're getting something out of this video. But in all fairness, there is a touch function regarding autofocus. You can actually touch on your subject and it will track them. But the Sony does have at least one clear advantage. Now, while both cameras have pop-up viewfinders, the Canon must be pulled out in order to activate it. Sony's older RX models did this, but the newer ones, it's just a one-press operation. Like that. It may not seem like a big deal, but I find that it actually is. You can also program the camera to shut off if you want when you close the viewfinder. I'm always forgetting to pull it out. Well, that didn't come out right.
It came out wrong.
Because the Sony pops out automatically. Now, the quality and clarity of both cameras' viewfinders are both excellent, even though they are kind of small. I would say I have to give the edge to the Sony. It just looks a little bigger. Zooming with both cameras is a very similar process with a rocker switch right by the shutter button. When I'm zooming, I'd like to know what my focal length is, like 28 or 35 millimeters, and you can't tell that with the Canon. It just gives you your focus range. When you're taking photos, the Sony will give you a bar which tells you what focal length and equivalent millimeters you're at, and so that's much appreciated. But a workaround for the Canon is programming the control ring in the menu so that operates your zoom. So just turning that ring will operate the zoom, and then it'll tell you in millimeters what your focal length is, and it jumps to very important focal lengths like 28, 35, 85, 100. except you can't go in between those focal lengths. Now, if you're shooting video, neither camera will tell you what the focal length is. Like in the Sony, you just see 5 times, 4 times, 3 times, but the Sony will tell you what your f-stop and ISO is. The Canon will not even give you that information. Speaking of video, both cameras can shoot up to 4K 30 video or 1080p 60. The difference is in the 4K 30 video with the Sony, it's downsampled from 5.5K capture. Now what does that mean? Does the video from the Sony look sharper? Let's take a look and see. 4K video on the Canon. This is 4K video on the Sony. Now let's crop in and magnify the image 300%. Here it is on the Sony. There is some digital noise, but I also see a lot of detail. When we go to the Canon, you see it looks a lot softer. So that oversampling really is benefiting the Sony. Also notice the color difference. The Canon is a lot warmer, the greens are more yellow, and this is just a color science difference between the two. But you probably know by now, if you've been researching these two cameras, that one of the big difference is the focal length or the zoom range. The Canon goes out to 120 millimeters, which is good, but the Sony goes all the way out to 200 millimeters. So here we are at full wide angle on the Sony, and here it is on the Canon. Look at all the color saturation difference. Now we're going to zoom in and you're going to see the difference. Here is the Canon's full 120 millimeter zoom compared to the Sony's, and you get in a lot tighter with the Sony. And you can also see how the color saturation is a little higher with the Canon. What about a sharpness difference? Here is the Sony at full wide. Here is the Canon at full wide. They both look good, but let's crop in to an unreasonable level. Here is the Canon cropped in, and here is the Sony cropped in. They look really, really close in the center. But let's move away from the center a little bit and see how consistent the lens is. Now pay attention to the bushes that I'm circling here on the left. Here it is on the Canon, and you see a little more detail in the Sony, so the Sony may have a little bit of an edge. Now we're going to zoom the Sony to 120 millimeters because that's as far as the Canon goes, so we'll keep it apples to apples. They look, again, very close here. Let's crop in. Here is the Sony at 120 cropped in, and here is the Canon, again, very close, but I think I'm seeing a little more detail in the bricks with the Sony, but that's with pixel peeping. So the Canon has a nice bright lens, wide open, it's 1.8, even at full zoom, it's 2.8, which is pretty good, whereas the Sony is 2.8 and then fully zoomed in f4.5. So here is the Sony at wide angle at its maximum f2.8 aperture compared to the Canon at wide angle at f1.8. I actually think the image looks a little sharper on the Sony in this case. Everything changes though at full zoom. The Sony has to go to 6400 on the ISO, and the Canon at 3200 just looks a lot better. Shot in a fairly low lit room, it looks a little grainy on the Sony. ISO is maxed, a little less grainy here, but also a little softer on the Canon. Hey, in situations like this, you can always use the pop-up flash, which is on both cameras, and both are tiltable so you can bounce them. These next shots were taken near total darkness. The Sony shutter speed was so slow and the f-stop not good. The Canon did a much better job here, much sharper, much better. So if you're going to be in total darkness, yeah, the Canon's better. And just a quick example to show you in video. Here the Sony, the ISO has to crank up to 1000 during twilight in the city. The Canon only to 640. Looks somewhat brighter and better, I would say. Now we are going to take a look at image quality side by side between these two cameras of the exact same scene. But first, I wanted to take each camera out on its own in everyday shooting situations to see how they do. First, here comes the Canon. Here is the Sony. So they both take pretty nice pictures, but if those pictures are not in focus, then they're not going to be pretty nice. Autofocus is one key difference between these two cameras. Sony has a more sophisticated phase detect autofocus system, but let's see how it compares with the Canon in the real world. Now this shot here was shot with the RX100 VII. You can see how it stays on my face, keeps my face in focus whether I move far or close. Now just another quick test here, again recorded with the RX100 Mark VII. Notice how the camera focuses on the Canon, and then when the Canon leaves the frame, it goes to the background, comes back into focus. Very confident, very smooth, very quick, precise. Now the Canon uses a contrast-based system. Let's see how it works. In this scene, the camera seems to stay focused on the fence in the background and is not really recognizing my face as quickly as the Sony did. Now let's try the same test. Again, this is still the G5XII trying to focus on the Sony camera. Seems to take a little longer than the Sony did, and it takes a little longer to get the background in focus, and when it does, there's a little bit of pulsing there, hesitation. Again, watch here, and it just sort of hunts a little bit on the camera, and as we go back to the background, again, you get that pulsing, and it is distracting. Now the Canon didn't fare well in that test, but I found out in regular shooting situations, if you're taking photos especially, there's really no issue. Most photos do come out in focus, the autofocus works well. If you're going to use the camera for video, especially for high speed and action video like sports, then this probably isn't the camera for you. Now the Sony does have a built-in mic input which the Canon doesn't have, but the problem is neither camera has a hot or cold shoe, so there's really nowhere to mount the mic. So let's take a look and see, or listen and see, the built-in mics. This is the audio from the Canon mic about 3 or 4 feet away, and now we're a little closer. Built-in mic on the Canon. Here's the built-in mic on the Sony about 3 feet away. Here's the built-in mic on the Sony. There is some wind, so you can get to hear some wind. When comparing these two scenes, also take a notice that the Sony looks like it exposed more properly on my face. It's a little overexposed on the Canon. And talking about exposure on faces, here's a little selfie test. Here is the Sony, and here is the Canon. You can judge for yourself which you like better. An often overlooked but useful feature is the near macro capability of these. Now I thought this interesting looking plant would be a good test of the macro, all the lines and colors, and the Canon did a good job of getting really up close and tight, as did the Sony. Seems that more of the image was in focus, greater depth of field with the Sony, and it was able to get a little closer. Now the built-in neutral density filter is unique to the G5XII. If you want to use a slow shutter speed to create that motion blur during the day, you need a neutral density filter, or else there's going to be an overexposure like this. You can put it on manual or automatic. I like this shot here. I shot this while panning with the camera. Well, how about a little romantic music to lighten the mood? Now some folks still prefer 1080p over 4K, so here's a comparison of the Sony and Canon in that format. Not sure if you can see on YouTube, but the 1080p is a lot softer than it is on the Sonys, which looks a lot crisper. I wasn't expecting that. You can also see it here too. This is another 1080p video with the Canon G5XII. See the artifacts, and that doesn't look good to me. I actually wanted to shoot this scene in 4K, but there's a quirk in the camera, and you should know about it because you need to be careful. In the menu, it's going to ask you to set up the movie size, and it's all FHD, which is full HD options. There's no 4K option. In order to get the 4K option, you have to have the top dial in the movie mode. Then when you're in the movie mode, it'll give you options to set up your 4K. And if you want to shoot in 4K, you got to be sure to be in that movie mode, or else when you hit the record button, you're going to be shooting an HD video. Both cameras give you the option of shooting 120 frames per second slow motion. Here it is on the Sony. You can only shoot for a few seconds and then it stops. There's like a limit, and then it has to process the footage. The Canon, there is no limit. They both look pretty similar, but I still think the Sony is a little sharper than the Canon, not by much. The RX100 has a couple of other HFR modes for slow motion, but they're not good. Now, both cameras have HDMI outs, and the Canon has a USB-C charger, which is supposed to charge the camera, and you can also use it for external power while recording. Now, just note, I was not able to charge the camera through the USB-C. I don't know what happened. The light would not come on. If your experience is different, please let me know. Now, both cameras do have a 30-minute video recording limit, so after a half hour, the cameras will stop recording video and you'll have to manually press the record button again. On the Sony, it actually shuts off after 5 minutes by default in 4K mode, but fortunately, you can go into the menu and change the temperature setting. That's done to prevent overheating, but practically, unless you're in really hot shooting situations or you're really going to be shooting for a long time, you can shoot well over 5 minutes with the Sony in 4K. Unlike the Canon, the Sony does have a time-lapse feature, but it doesn't stitch it together in camera. The Sony can shoot 20 frames per second, and there's a separate mode for 90 frames per second with a maximum of only 7 frames, compared to Canon's 8 frames per second and 30 frames per second in raw burst. So I went around town with both cameras side by side. Let's take a look and see how they compare to each other. So what do you think? Which of these two cameras is for you? I promise I'd tell you by the end of the video which one I decided on, but I'm not going to tell you.
Liar.
Okay, I'll tell you. After careful consideration, I decided on the RX100 VII. The main reason is when I'm out shooting, I just feel that while the Canon does have a decent zoom at that 120mm equivalent, I just feel I need to get in tighter at times, and the Sony gives me the opportunity to do that. It's a pretty big difference between 200 and 120, and if I'm carrying a camera around anyway, I might as well get the best possible zoom. And if I want to go even further than 200mm, Sony has a clear image zoom, and I discussed that feature in my full review of the RX100 VII. Feel free to check that out. The other factor is the pop-up viewfinder, which is just that one-step operation with the Sony. I find with the Canon, sometimes I'll miss the moment having to pull out the viewfinder, especially if you're doing street photography. Things can happen really quickly. That's not to say that I don't like the Canon. It is a very good camera as well. They both produce very similar images, as I showed you on the side-by-side test. The low light is better on the Canon, for sure, but the zoom is way better on the Sony. For basic low light and general room lighting, it's hard to tell the two apart unless you really crop in. So for me, most of the time, I'm going to be shooting outdoors anyway. You have a flash if you need it. So unless you're using the camera in really low light situations, almost in near darkness, then the Canon really is going to show that it's that much better, or you're using the telephoto in low light situations, which honestly you probably shouldn't be doing anyway. Then the Canon's going to be a lot better. But for everyday shooting, the Sony is, to me, the camera I'm gonna go with, and that Canon is going on eBay. I'd like to know what you think in the comment section. Which camera do you think is better? What would you go with? And do you hope there's a successor to either of these two cameras? I sure hope there is. And I have a video discussing the possibility of that. Please check that out as well. Thanks for staying with me to the end. It's much appreciated. See you in the next video.